interested in gender and disaster?
I became interested in gender and disaster through my research. I didn't choose a gendered axis of analysis for my research, it chose me. There was gendered dimensions of disaster resilience and vulnerability throughout my research, and that was from interviews with householders, wildland firefighters, Aboriginal elders. There was an amazing amount of gender in there and I just couldn't ignore it.
Okay, so what has your research revealed about gender and disaster?
My research has revealed that gender matters in disaster because women and men have different levels of risk tolerance. So gendered norms in society, those really embedded everyday occurrences that we hardly ever question, are incredibly gendered, and this is historically and it's culturally. We are cultured into acting in certain ways, and when it comes to disaster preparedness, response and recovery, we find that gendered norms in the everyday impact on how women and men prepare, engage with risk, and also how exposed they are to the various consequences.
Can you give a couple of examples?
Some examples of that would be in terms of looking at what men and women's intended plans of action are. So we're looking at whether they plan to leave early, evacuate, whether they plan to stay and defend, or whether their plan is to wait and see. And in Australia, we recommend that people have a written bushfire survival plan that will enable to assist them when danger is lurking. What we're finding is that those survival plans often have not been discussed as a household, and that leads to potential conflict when there's danger and there's a lot of panic, there's a lot of anxiety. People disagree and it leads to often to last-minute disagreements that can have fatal consequences. And when we look at fatality statistics from the 1900s to the present day, we know that most men have died outside defending assets, and we know that most women have died either sheltering passively or evacuating. When you compare that with what men and women's intended plans of actions are today, we find that most men, or almost 3 times the amount of men, plan to stay and defend compared with women, and almost 3 times the amount of women plan to leave early compared with men. So there's clear correlations between current day actions or intended actions and fatality statistics historically.
Why is it important to consider gender in emergency management?
Gender is important in emergency management because gender structure men and women's level of risk tolerance and their level of awareness, their level of engagement, both before, during and after disasters. Gender is also important in emergency management because even when policy appears gender aware, we know that the predominant norms in society are more often than not reproduced by organisations, institutions like emergency services. They're more often reproduced than they're challenged, and that means that the very embedded prejudices and inequalities that we have in society that are gendered are reproduced within organisations, even though it might be unconscious on behalf of the people who are creating these scenarios where inequalities are part and parcel of everyday policy and procedure.
Can you think of any examples within emergency management where that's evident?
It's evident it's gendered structures within agencies are evident at most levels, so be it from the job ads that advertise, say, firefighting positions, the language they're written in often is very gendered. It's focused on men because the profession historically has been very male dominated. It's also got a lot to do with perceptions, and these are cultured perceptions that we are cultured into not even questioning in in everyday life, which has to do with how we're built, our physique, our psychological characteristics. So men more often are considered to be strong, they've got a better form of stamina, they're less prone to crying, where women are perceived to be physically weaker. They have menstrual cycles that could impact on their ability to perform, say, remote firefighting tasks. But what we then also see there is how that can impact on the resilience of, say, firefighters. So where male firefighters will suppress the emotional distress that can be part and parcel of the job, and therefore not seek help. And we've seen that both in the form of isolated behaviour, we've seen it in form of excessive alcohol intake, we've seen it in the form of just aggressive behaviour, we see it with drugs. It comes across in various disguises, where women on the other hand often have to fight very strongly to prove their competencies as firefighters.
In our research, we hear, what about the men? What would be your answer to that question?
My answer to the question, what about the men, is that men absolutely matter in trying to create more equitable and more resilient forms of structures, be it within emergency management or be it in the homes. So whether we're talking about a resilient household because everyone's been part of the planning for disaster, where it's not a matter of one party dictating to others what they should do, but that every household member comes together regardless of gender and age and actually talks through, discusses, writes down and practices a plan, and men are as much part of that as women are and as children are. It matters in emergency management because men predominantly occupy the positions within emergency services. They're often, more often than women, the ones that hold the more senior positions, and therefore they are more likely to have a direct say in policy. They're more directly responsible for the public face of the organisation. So, and one thing that we often find is that media portrays a particular gendered story when it comes to emergency services. Men are portrayed often as heroes and women are portrayed as victims that need to be rescued. Well, we all know that that is not the case these days. We know that women and men are capable at all levels, and so how our media portrays these gendered stereotypes really impacts on how we as society still accept these stereotypical norms and how gender continues to be embedded into our society.
Yes, that's interesting. Also, the What About the Men research was based around women and women's concerns that they weren't engaging with help services in the aftermath of the bushfires. What do you say in that context about What About the Men? What could be happening or should be happening there?
In the context of seeking help, and for both men and women, when either recovering from the trauma of a disaster or recovering from the exposure directly or indirectly through their work, it is very important that we as a society acknowledge that men have a tendency to isolate themselves rather than to seek help. And there are some very clear findings from the Black Saturday fires where it was seen that women would get together, whether it was a knitting group or a cooking group, they would get together, they would talk and laugh and cry together, and they would simply have a voice amongst themselves to try and come to terms with the devastation that they were experiencing all around them. Men more often got really busy in their sheds or out in the fields, digging holes, repairing the fences on their own. They were not given the opportunity or not seeking the opportunity to express how deeply hurt they felt, either because they had experienced direct losses or because they had witness terrible things, and invariably, because of how our society perceives men as the carers and the protectors, often they felt guilty, even though they were by no means to blame more than anyone else in their society for what happened. But still, they carry that on their own without getting help. And by not seeking help, by not finding, even if it's just a mate that lends an ear for them to voice their distress, that can be a watershed change in how you recover long term.
So what do you think would help women survive disaster and its aftermath better, and also men? What things would help?
What would help both men and women survive disasters and recover better is preparedness. Preparedness, preparedness, preparedness. Talking through the various dimensions that you might be exposed to, acknowledging that uncertainty is part and parcel of disaster. So no matter what they prepare for, they're unlikely to be facing that particular scenario. So knowing that there's going to be most likely a source of distress, there's going to be various forms of disagreements, and being prepared that they will have to face that while they're panicking and emotional and often fearing for their life or the lives of those they love. So preparing for that, having the discussions about that, will help both men and women deal with the actual event, but it will also help them recover, because psychological research has shown clearly that people who are prepared for an event, even if they lose everything they own, by knowing that that was a potential consequence of a disaster, they have some form of mental hook to pull them up again. So they are able to keep going. And one of the things we've seen in bushfires is that people who have a plan, they have managed to pack and save some crucial elements of their house. So even if they lose their house, they don't lose their home, because they've got the most precious possessions with them. And that can make all the difference.
Okay. Do you have an example of when the lack of attention to gender had negative outcomes, or indeed one where attention to gender had positive outcomes?
An example of where gender has had a positive outcome is with regards to the ability to speak out, and be that at a local level, at a regional level, or at a national level, say through a conference. So I think it's very heartening to see how, as an emergency service industry, slowly academic research, social work, the likes of that have been acknowledged. And rather than saying, well, that's very academic and we don't know how to deal with it, inviting those people in to actually have a conversation. Having conversation nationally amongst emergency services personnel might not change things in the course of one day, but certainly plant seeds that then starts to change the culture that we're working within. And so I think within the last 5 years, we've seen big changes in Australia in emergency management, just in terms of acknowledging that we've got an issue on our hands when it comes to gender norms, gendered structures, gendered inequality, both within the services but also in the everyday environments where we deal with householders who we are either protecting or dictating to what they should do.
So what's precipitated this change in thought and mentality, or this slow shift?
I think it's partly part of a generational shift, that as a culture, naturally there are changes as in the course of history. Very sadly, I think also, there's so many things that we still haven't even started to talk about. So I think one of the really confronting things about bringing gender onto the disaster agenda is that who knows what's going to crop up. It's almost like opening a can of worms. The really important thing is that we keep going, because by having the conversations, we are slowly creating change, and that means that something will change for someone every day.